The digital clock on the bedside table flickered, the red numbers burning a hole in the darkness. 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes to midnight. 2 minutes left of a day that had felt interminable, stretched thin by a humidity so oppressive it felt as though the very air in Blackwood Manor had turned to wet wool. I lay perfectly still, staring up at the plaster ceiling medallion I couldn't see but knew by heart every acanthus leaf, every chip in the paint from the damp winter of '98. The manor was breathing around me. It always did when a storm approached. The barometer must have plummeted in the last hour because the familiar, dull ache in my left knee had flared into a sharp, rhythmic throb. Outside, the wind was picking up, dragging its knuckles against the stone facade of the house, rattling the heavy sash windows in their frames. It was a suffocating pressure, a heaviness that pressed against my chest, pinning me to the silk sheets. I listened to the house settle. The timber beams, cut from forests that no longer existed, groaned deep within the walls. The floorboards in the hallway outside my door creaked, phantom footsteps caused by the temperature shift, or so I always told myself. The smell of ozone was thick, drifting in through the inch of open window I had insisted on leaving ajar, despite the housekeeper's warnings. It smelled of impending violence, of electricity waiting to discharge. Then, the silence shattered. It wasn't a mobile phone. It wasn't the polite, digital chime of a text message or the buzzing vibration of a notification. It was the heavy, archaic unit that sat on the mahogany desk in the corner of my room, a device that hadn't rung in perhaps 5 years. The sound was a mechanical shriek, a physical bell being struck by a metal hammer. In the quiet dark, it sounded like a scream rearing ring. RRR, ring-ring. My heart hammered against my ribs. A chaotic rhythm that made my breath catch. Who calls a landline at midnight? The police? The hospital? A wrong number from a drunkard stumbling home? I threw off the heavy duvet, the cold air immediately biting at my skin. My bare feet hit the hardwood floor, sending a jolt of chill up my spine. I moved through the room, navigating by the flashes of heat lightning that pulsed behind the heavy velvet curtains. The phone rang again, demanding, insistent. I reached the desk, my hand hovering over the receiver. The plastic was cold, covered in a fine layer of dust that I felt transfer to my fingertips. I picked it up. Hello. My voice was a croak, unused for hours. Martha. The name came out as a desperate exhale. I barely recognized the voice. It was thick, slurred at the edges, yet terrified. Arthur? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. Arthur Sterling, my lawyer, the man who had managed the Blackwood estate since my husband passed. The man who had sat at my Christmas table for 30 years. Arthur, it's midnight. Is everything? Don't turn on the lights, he hissed. The command was sharp, cutting through his obvious intoxication. Do not turn on the lights. Martha, are you in the dark? Yes, but good. Stay in the dark. Just listen to me. I can't let him do this. I told myself it was just business, that it was time to hand over the reins. But, God help me, I can't watch it happen. I could hear the clink of glass against glass on his end, the distinct sound of a decanter hitting a tumbler. Scotch. Arthur always drank Glenfiddich when he was troubled. Tonight, he sounded like he was drowning in it. Arthur, you're frightening me. What are you talking about? I'm in the office, he whispered, his voice dropping so low I had to press the receiver painfully against my ear. Downtown. He's here, Martha. He thinks I'm in the washroom. He thinks I'm on board. Who is there? Julian, the son. The name hung in the air between us, suspended in the static of the telephone line. A confused laugh bubbled in my throat. Julian. Julian is in his apartment. He's studying for the bar exam. He told me he was pulling an all-nighter with his study group. He is pulling an all-nighter, Arthur said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disgust. But he isn't studying law, Martha. He's breaking it. He is rewriting the narrative. You're drunk, Arthur. I am, he admitted, a sob catching in his throat. But I am sober enough to know that what he is doing right now, at my desk, is the end of you. He's forging the amendment. Martha, I've been showing him the protocols for a month, how the trust is structured, how the medical clauses work. My blood ran cold, colder than the floor beneath my feet. What medical clauses? The competency clause, Arthur wept. He's signing your name. He's signing the document that declares you mentally unfit due to early onset dementia. It grants him immediate, durable power of attorney over the entire Blackwood portfolio, the house, the accounts, the library. That's impossible, I whispered, though the denial felt hollow even as I spoke it. Julian wouldn't. He has soft eyes. He's my boy. Listen, Arthur commanded. I'm going to hold the phone up to the door. Just listen. There was a fumbling sound, then a shift in the acoustic space on the line. The background hum of Arthur's office fan became louder. And then, I heard it. It was faint, but in the silence of the manor, it was deafening. Sc rich, scratch, scritch, the rhythmic, dry sound of a fountain pen moving across high-quality linen paper. It paused. A heavy Julian's sigh, the one he made when he was frustrated with a puzzle. Then the sound resumed. Scritch, scratch. It was precise, deliberate. It was the sound of my identity being stolen, stroke, by the hand I had held when it was small enough to curl around my thumb. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and sudden. I wanted to scream, to reject it. But as the sound of that pen scratched through the phone line, the puzzle pieces of the last month slammed into place with sickening clarity. My diamond tennis bracelet, missing from the vanity 2 weeks ago. I had thought I misplaced it. Julian had helped me look for it, gently suggesting that perhaps I was becoming forgetful. The phone calls he took in the garden, pacing back and forth, hanging up the moment I stepped onto the terrace. And yesterday, tea time, I had been pouring Earl Grey into a china cup, and I had looked up to find him watching me. His expression hadn't been one of love, or even impatience. It was a look of clinical assessment. He was watching my hand tremble slightly under the weight of the silver pot, waiting for a spill, waiting for evidence. He wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at an obstacle that needed to be removed. The scratching stopped on the other end of the line. Done, I heard Julian's voice say, muffled through the door, but unmistakable. That's the last one. It looks perfect. Arthur, better than hers. Arthur pulled the phone back. His breathing was ragged. Did you hear him, Martha? He thinks you're losing your mind, and tomorrow morning, he's going to make sure the rest of the world thinks so too. I stood there in the dark, the storm finally breaking outside, rain lashing against the glass like handfuls of gravel. The cold sweat on my skin turned to ice. My son wasn't studying to uphold the law. He was perfecting the art of destroying me. Martha, Arthur whispered, what do we do? I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white, the shock dissolving into something harder, something sharper. If Julian wanted a war over my sanity, he had severely underestimated the clarity of my rage. Arthur, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the heartbreak shattering my chest. Lock the door. Do not let him leave that room with those papers. I can't stop him, Martha. Then you had better find a way to stall him, I cut in, because if he thinks I am losing my mind, perhaps I should show him exactly what a madwoman is capable of. The line went dead. I stood alone in the dark, the dial tone humming in my ear, realizing that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just entered my house. How does a mother survive the realization that she has raised a monster? I hung up the phone, but the disconnect did not sever the connection to the horror Arthur had poured into my ear. It merely sealed it inside the room with me. The dial tone faded, replaced by the relentless drumming of the rain against the slate roof, a sound that usually lulled me to sleep but now sounded like 1,000 fingers tapping impatiently for my attention. I did not turn on the lights. Arthur had been right about that. If Julian returned early, if he was driving back from the city right now, headlights sweeping the driveway, could not be found standing in the foyer, illuminated like a stage actor. I had to become part of the house. I had to become a ghost in my own home. I moved into the hallway, my bare feet silent on the Persian runners. The house felt vast, cavernous, and suddenly predatory. Every shadow cast by the lightning flashes seemed to stretch and contort, mimicking the deception that had taken root under this roof. I navigated by memory and touch, my hand trailing along the wainscoting as I headed toward the west wing. This was where Julian had set up his temporary study for the summer, claiming the light was better for his grueling study sessions. The door to the study was ajar. I pushed it open, and the scent hit me before I even crossed the threshold. Sandalwood and expensive leather. It was Julian's cologne, a scent I had bought him for his birthday. It used to smell grounding, masculine, and comforting, the smell of a young man growing into his potential. Now, in the suffocating humidity of the storm, it smelled cloying. It smelled of masks and lies. It smelled like the sweet rot of fruit that looks perfect on the outside, but is teeming with worms beneath the skin. I moved to his desk, a heavy mahogany piece that had belonged to his father. I ran my hand over the surface, trembling. I needed proof. Arthur's word was panicked and drunken, and a mother's heart is a fortress built to withstand even the most battering rams of logic. Not Julian. whispered the part of me that remembered nursing him. Yes, Julian, whispered the part of me that remembered the look in his eyes yesterday. I pulled open the top drawer. Pens, neatly aligned. A stress ball. I closed it. I opened the side drawer, pushing aside a stack of Harvard Law Review journals. They were arranged phonetically, almost too perfectly, like props on a set. I dug my fingers underneath the bottom journal, my nail catching on something paper-bound. I pulled it out, a yellow legal pad. I tilted it toward the window, waiting for the next flash of lightning to illuminate the page. When the flash came, it lit up the room in a stark, blue-white explosion, freezing the world in a momentary photograph. The page was covered in blue ink, repetitive loops and lines. Martha V. Blackwood, Martha V. Blackwood, Martha V. Blackwood. My breath hitched. A jagged sound in the quiet room. It was my signature. Dozens of them. The ones at the top of the page were hesitant. The M2 peaked, the loop of the B2 narrow. But as my eyes traveled down the page, the mimicry became terrifying. The slant was corrected. The pressure points heavy on the downstroke of the K. Light on the finish were replicated with surgical precision. By the bottom of the page, it wasn't a forgery anymore. It was me. He had captured the essence of my hand, the muscle memory of 40 years of signing checks and contracts, and he had stolen it. I flipped the page, my fingers feeling numb. Tucked between the sheets was a crumpled receipt, thermal paper soft with age. I squinted at the faint text, quick stamp, notary, and bond, located in the garment district, a place tucked between warehouses and wholesalers. Nowhere near the prestigious law firms Julian claimed to be interning with. Why would my son, the heir to the Blackwood fortune, be buying a notary stamp from a shop that likely operated out of a basement? The answer made my stomach turn. He wasn't just forging my signature, he was building the mechanism to validate it. He was creating a closed loop where he was the signer, the witness, and the beneficiary. I leaned back against the heavy leather chair, the nausea rising, and then, a sudden memory washed over me, visceral and sharp. Thanksgiving. 2 weeks ago we were in the main dining room. Julian had insisted on hosting, calling it a legacy dinner. He had brought a bottle of 1998 Cabernet, uncorking it with a flourish. The candlelight had danced in the reflection of the crystal goblets. I remembered the taste of the wine, velvety rich, with a finish that lingered. Julian had raised his glass, his smile charming, his eyes bright. "To your health, mother," he had said, "and to the future." But he hadn't been looking at my face. I remembered it now with a clarity that made my skin crawl. His gaze had been fixed lower, on my neck, on the diamond choker I wore for special occasions. It was a predatory gaze, calculating the carat weight, the liquidity of the asset. "By the way," he had asked casually, slicing into the roast duck, "does the executor clause in father's trust still require 2 non-family witnesses, or did you update that in 19 like we discussed? I was just reading a case study on trust disputes and thought of you." I had smiled, touched by his interest. "It still requires 2, darling. Why fix what isn't broken?" "Right," he had murmured, taking a sip of wine. 2 witnesses, good to know. I had thought he was being a diligent student. He was doing reconnaissance. He was checking the locks before he picked them. A chime pulled me back to the present, a soft, electronic ping. On the corner of the desk, Julian's iPad sat in its leather case. He must have left it behind in his rush to get to Arthur's office. The screen had lit up with a notification, the glow illuminating the dark wood of the desk like a beacon. I shouldn't look, I should leave, but my hand moved of its own accord, tapping the screen. It wasn't locked. He was so arrogant, so sure of his privacy in this house, that he hadn't even set a passcode. The message app was open. There was a draft, unsent, typed out to a contact saved only as shark. I read the words, and the floor seemed to drop out from under me. "The old man is folding. He's weeping into his scotch. I might have to handle him after I sign the papers. Then the house is ours. Handle him." The words floated in the blue light of the screen. This wasn't just theft. This wasn't just greed. Julian wasn't just trying to steal my money. He was communicating with someone called Shock, and he was discussing Arthur Sterling, a man who had known him since he was in diapers, as a loose end that needed to be handled. The wind howled outside, slamming a branch against the window with a violence that made me jump. I looked down at the iPad, the blue light casting corpse-like shadows on my hands. My son was currently in a room with Arthur, who was drunk, emotional, and trying to stop him, and Julian, who had just admitted that he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to secure the prize. I wasn't dealing with a rebellious child. I was dealing with a monster who had been wearing my son's face for weeks, perhaps years. And if he was willing to handle Arthur, what exactly did he have planned for me once the papers were signed? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour, a singular, mournful note that resonated through the floorboards. It was 1:30 a.m. The storm had not abated. Rather, it had settled into a relentless, punishing rhythm, battering the east face of Blackwood Manor with a fury that felt personal. I sat in the Habakkuk leather wing chair in the library, positioned deliberately to face the double oak doors. The room was a cavern of shadows, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth and the unnatural, clinical glow of the iPad resting on the side table next to me. In my lap, the yellow legal pad felt heavy, like a stone tablet etched with a commandment I had broken. Thou shalt not trust. Then, the light came. Twin beams of halogen white swept across the heavy velvet curtains, cutting through the gloom of the library like prisons. The gravel in the driveway crunched under tires, a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. Julian was home. I didn't move. I didn't tremble. The terror I had felt an hour ago had calcified into something brittle and sharp. I listened to the heavy thud of the car door closing, the beep of the alarm locking, the rapid, squelching footsteps running up the stone stairs to the portico. The front door opened with a groan of hinges, admitting the roar of the wind for a brief second before slamming shut. That silence returned to the house. But it was a different kind of silence. It was pregnant with presence. Mother. His voice drifted from the foyer, echoing off the marble. It sounded tight, laced with a forced casualness that scraped against my nerves. I remained silent. I heard his wet shoes squeak on the parquet flooring. He was moving toward the kitchen, then paused. He must have seen the faint glow from the library. The footsteps changed direction, becoming slower, more hesitant. The library doors pushed open. Julian stood framed in the archway. He was drenched. His expensive Italian wool coat was dark with rain, water dripping from the hem onto the Persian rug. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were wide, darting around the room with a manic energy that bordered on feverish. When his gaze landed on me, he flinched, but instantly, the mask slid into place. A smile, placid and practiced, stretched his lips. Mother, he breathed, exhaling a puff of air. My God, you startled me. Why on earth are you sitting in the dark? It's nearly 2 a.m. He took a step into the room, reaching for the light switch. Leave it, I said. My voice was low, devoid of any warmth. It stopped his hand in midair. All right, he chuckled nervously, wiping rain from his eyes. Is everything okay? You look ... intense. I was just at the office, pulling that all-nighter I told you about. The storm is absolute hell out there. The roads are. I didn't let him finish his script. I simply lifted the yellow legal pad from my lap, turning it so the firelight caught the indented grooves of the blue ink. Martha v. Blackwood. Martha v. Blackwood. The silence that followed was absolute. It sucked the air out of the room. Julian stared at the pad, his smile twitching, faltering, and then, slowly, dissolving. The boyish charm evaporated, leaving behind something hard and unfamiliar. Where did you get that? He asked. The concern was gone. His voice was flat. I found it under your journals, I said, my eyes never leaving his face. Next to the receipt for the notary stamp. Next to the draft on your iPad where you discuss handling Arthur. Julian froze. He looked at the iPad glowing on the table, then back at me. I expected him to crumble. I expected the child I had raised to fall to his knees, to beg, to explain that it was a mistake, a momentary lapse of judgment induced by stress. I prepared myself for his tears. But Julian didn't cry. He laughed. It was a dry, barking sound that had no humor in it. He threw his wet coat onto the floor with a violent thud and walked toward the fireplace, running a hand through his damp hair. I told Arthur he was sloppy, Julian muttered, shaking his head. I told him you were too sharp for your own good. But he was too busy hyperventilating into his scotch to listen. You admit it, I whispered, the pain hitting me like a physical blow. You were going to steal everything. You were going to declare me incompetent. Steal. Julian spun around, his face twisted in a sneer. You can't steal what should already be yours. You're sitting on a mountain of gold, Mother, hoarding it like a dragon while the world changes. You donate to what? Historical preservation societies, cat shelters, while I have vision, I have opportunities that are rotting on the vine because you're too busy clutching your pearls. And Arthur? I asked, my voice trembling with rage. Arthur has been loyal to this family for 30 years. How did you get him to agree to this? Loyalty? Julian spat the word. Arthur is a degenerate gambler, Mother. He's in the hole for 6 figures to people you don't ever want to meet. I didn't have to push hard. I just offered him a lifeboat. He sold you out for the price of his kneecaps. The vulgarity of it, the sheer, naked greed, was nauseating. He wasn't just a thief. He was a predator. He had smelled weakness in Arthur and exploited it. Julian took a step toward me, his eyes locking onto the iPad. Give me the tablet. No, give it to me. He lunged, closing the distance between us. He loomed over the chair, smelling of ozone and expensive leather and sweat. Do you think anyone will believe you? You're an old woman, sitting in the dark. I have the papers. I have the medical experts lined up. You're senile, Mother. You're confused. Who are they going to believe? The bright young lawyer with a future, or the grieving widow who talks to her plants? He reached for the device, his fingers inches from the screen. I wouldn't do that, I said, my voice cutting through his hysteria. He paused, his hand hovering. Why are you going to stop me? No, I said, sliding my hand into the pocket of my dressing gown. But the police might. Julian blinked. What? I pulled out my mobile phone. The screen was illuminated, the timer counting upward, 42 minutes and 15 seconds. Arthur didn't hang up. Julian, I said, watching the color drain from his face. I put him on mute. He heard everything. Every word you just said about his gambling, about the forgery, about your vision. Julian's eyes widened, darting to the phone in my hand. And, I continued, gesturing to the heavy antique landline on the desk behind me, the receiver lying off the hook, half hidden by a stack of books. I have 911 on the other line. The operator has been listening for the last 5 minutes. They heard you threaten me. They heard you admit to the fraud. The thunder cracked directly overhead, a sound like a bomb detonating, shaking the window panes in their frames. The room flashed white with lightning, illuminating Julian's face in stark relief. The vein in his neck was bulging, pulsing with a frantic rhythm, but it was his eyes that froze the blood in my veins. There was no regret there, no shame, no realization of the moral abyss he had fallen into. There was only hatred, pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at the landline, then back at me, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The distance between us was less than 3 feet. The sirens were likely minutes away, faint wails, lost in the storm. You think you've won, he whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying quietness. But the police are 5 minutes away, Mother, and a lot can happen in the dark in 5 minutes. He took a step closer, and for the first time in my life, I looked at my son and didn't see a boy. I saw a stranger who realized he had nothing left to lose. Does a mother's love end the moment she realizes her child is capable of killing her? The storm had exhausted itself, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum. Dawn was breaking over Blackwood Manor, but it wasn't the triumphant burst of sunlight I had often admired from my bedroom window. It was a cold, gray creeping of light that revealed the wreckage of the night with unforgiving clarity. I stood on the front portico, wrapped tightly in a heavy cashmere shawl, the damp morning air biting at my exposed ankles. The driveway, usually pristine and raked, was a chaotic tableau of mud, tire tracks, and the strobing blue lights of 3 police cruisers. The lights cut through the low-hanging mist in rhythmic, silent pulses, blue, black, illuminating the whetstone of the manor's facade. They brought him out. Julian didn't look like the confident heir who had toasted to my health 2 weeks ago. He didn't even look like the monster who had cornered me in the library. He looked small. The rain had plastered his hair to his skull, and his expensive shirt was torn at the collar, result of the brief struggle when the officers had breached the front doors. His hands were cuffed behind his back, forcing his shoulders into a slump of defeat. He didn't look up at me. He kept his gaze fixed on the gravel, his jaw set in a rigid line of defiance. As the officer guided him toward the back of the cruiser, protecting his head with a practiced hand, I waited for a glance, a sign of remorse, a plea, even a glare. But he gave me nothing. He slid into the back seat of the vehicle, disappearing behind the safety glass, becoming just another detainee in the system. He had thought he could manipulate. It wasn't the forgery charges that had taken him. Not yet. It was the recording on the 911 line, the clear, undeniable threat of physical harm, the assault on a senior, the menacing intent. The forgery would come later, a slow-moving avalanche of forensic accounting that would bury him for years, but for now, he was simply a dangerous man being removed from society. A second car, a black sedan I knew well, was parked near the gate. Arthur Sterling stood beside it. He hadn't come closer. He looked like a ruin of a man, his trench coat hanging loosely on his frame, his face gray and unshaven. He watched the police car pull away, his eyes hollow. He didn't look at me either. He knew there was nothing to say. The surrender of his license, the confession to the Bar Association, the dismantling of his career, it was all a foregone conclusion now. He got into his car and drove away, following the police lights like a mourner in a funeral procession. Silence rushed back into the void they left behind. I turned and looked at the house. The front door was wide open, gaping like a wound. The foyer beyond was dark. For 40 years, I had viewed this estate as a legacy. I had polished the banisters, preserved the tapestries, and managed the investments, all with the singular belief that I was building a kingdom for my son. I had endured the loneliness of widowhood because I believed I was the steward of his future. But as I stood there in the mist, the truth settled on me, heavier than the wet wool on my shoulders. The secret I had uncovered wasn't just a forged will or a stolen trust fund. The secret was that I had raised a stranger. I had seen the signs, hadn't I? The lack of empathy when his childhood dog died, the way he manipulated his teachers, the cold calculation in his eyes when he asked about money. I had seen them all, and I had buried them under layers of maternal rationalization. I had ignored the truth because I wanted to be loved more than I wanted to be safe. I had wanted the fantasy of the devoted son so desperately that I had allowed a viper to nest in my bed, turned my back on the driveway and walked inside. The sound of the heavy oak door closing was final. Thud. I threw the deadbolt. Click. Then the chain. Clatter. The sounds echoed in the vast, empty foyer. The house felt enormous, a cavern of stone and wood that suddenly felt devoid of life, but it also felt secure. The predator was gone. I walked to the library. The room was cold. The fire I had sat by earlier reduced to a pile of gray ash. The smell of ozone and Julian's cologne still lingered faintly, a ghost of the violence that had occurred hours ago. I knelt by the hearth. My knees popped, a reminder of my age, a reminder of my frailty, but my hands were steady. I picked up a long match from the brass holder and struck it against the brick. The flame flared to life, smelling of sulfur, sharp, cleansing scent. I reached for the yellow legal pad that lay on the floor where Julian had thrown it. I tore off the top sheet. Martha V. Blackwood. The signature stared back at me, perfect, deceptive, a lie written in my own name. I held the corner of the paper to the flame. The fire caught instantly, curling the yellow paper brown, then black. I watched the blue ink of the forgery bubble and vanish. I didn't throw it in. I held it, watching it burn until the heat licked at my fingertips, dropping it into the grate only at the last second. I tore off the next sheet, and the next. I fed them to the fire one by one. I was burning the evidence, yes, but I was also burning the dynasty. The Blackwood name would end with me. There would be no heir to inherit the manor, no son to carry the burden of this history. And strangely, the thought didn't bring me sorrow. It brought me peace. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was time to call the city. I needed a new firm, a firm with no connection to Arthur, no knowledge of Julian. I needed to rewrite the will, not to protect a legacy, but to dismantle it. The preservation societies, the libraries, the charities, they would get it all. I watched the last scrap of paper turn to ash, the sparks drifting up the chimney into the gray morning. A will is a promise to the future. Last night I realized my future isn't my son, it's what I leave behind despite him. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library. Waiting for you.